Well, this is a very special day and date, which I will return to. I want to thank Toro and Rena, Karen and Doug, for the honor of being on a panel with them, the first panel, which was dazzling, and Guido for last night's keynote and really starting us off. I think I'm not alone in this room. The phrase "out of phase" is echoing in my head and I think might never leave. It's a framework to understand and think about life and maybe to value individuality that's very special. This is Charles, and I am a bit of a shutterbug and sometimes snap too many photos, but I do love having them. And so I have this one that I snapped of him in 2008 at Morey's. After he had been a speaker at the Yale Law School reunion that year. Harold was the dean, and Charles and Harold and others were up on the dais, and it was a special thing. I was a tag-along. I am not a product of Yale Law School, but I'm lucky to have received over the years a lot of its history, power, friendship, and embrace. And a lot of that has been Charles Reich, who was, even after his departure, very much a man of Yale Law School. My contact with Charles Reich began long before I met him or had any personal contact with him. I read The Greening of America, I think, in high school, because I had kind of a hippie teacher and influence in that direction. And I read it thereafter many times. It was one of those books where I always had a copy till I lost it, but there are so many in print in used bookstores, et cetera, so I always restocked. And as I was raising two kids on Long Island, I had restocked. And over the years, and at some point, they kind of remembered this and then figured out it was connected to this guy who was my friend. I would read them the last two paragraphs of The Greening of America aloud. Just stop and listen to this. And they'd roll their eyes and they'd have soccer practice. And I was being a dad. But that was Charles's language and the power of the book. That first got me. Then early on as a law professor, I figured I'm starting to write law review articles and I should read the great ones. And I remember reading Gunther's Harvard Forward on the Equal Protection Clause, but The New Property was probably the first one that I really read and looked at. And then as I was starting to write things, I contacted Charles out of the blue because I was writing about Leon Higginbotham, for whom I had the good fortune to be a law clerk. And Leon and Charles had been classmates in the Yale Law School class of 1952. John Frank was their professor. Leon Higginbotham went with Frank to hear the oral argument in Sweat versus Painter. I called Charles out of the blue to ask if he knows anything about that. He really didn't, but that began our contact. And early on, Charles asked me, what do you want to work on? And I said, well, I'm interested in lives, facts, biography, the U.S. Supreme Court, Robert Jackson, and that kind of time period is what I'm starting to work on. And he said, I remember being a young law professor. He said, I would get the summer and I'd get ready to start on a writing project and I'd get a big table in the Yale Law School library and I would amass all the books I wanted in front of me, and then I really focused on my topic and I decided to write about America. And I thought, whoa, the water is very deep. More recently, since 2017, I've also had a contact with Charles, and it will be a permanent one, I think. My wife and I left our Long Island empty nest after the kids had, and we moved to a Manhattan apartment and sent out change of address cards to various friends, including Charles, who immediately emailed back, 315 East 68th Street. That's where Peter and I grew up. So every day, as I walk the terrazzo hallway in my building, I'm not sure I'm on the right floor. We were never able to quite pin that down. I'm in Charles's home, which is a pretty cool permanent echo that I get to enjoy. And I'm with Judith. It's not just at these personal levels. It's at the intellectual and societal and legal levels. Charles is all around us, especially if you're a friend, an acolyte, a student, you know to look for it. But I think you can be taught to look for it. I'll give you just two examples that popped up and I noted them just because I was getting ready for this. One was the obituary of the comedian Buck Henry, who passed away recently. He was a performer on Saturday Night Live and involved in various films and so forth, and he wrote The Graduate. And The Graduate is a story of the alienation of young people in the time period where Charles was teaching them at Yale, and they were sort of moving from their alienation to their protest, to their higher consciousness, etc. In other words, in a way, the younger siblings of The Graduate are the Greening of America, at least if you're looking for it. More directly, maybe more shockingly, last Saturday I was watching for a portion of the Senate impeachment trial, and there was President Trump's counsel, Patrick Philbin, making an argument about the importance of cross-examination, which of course had been denied to the president with all the witnesses who had been called in the House proceedings. And this was outrageous, argued counsel Philbin, because it runs against the grain long recognized by the US Supreme Court in Goldberg versus Kelly, blah, blah, blah. So there's Charles Reich as an intellectual asset to the defense of Donald Trump in the impeachment trial. I want to thank Roger, who deserves a special shout out. And this is a photo of him with Charles at that same evening in New Haven in 2008. His friendship meant a great deal to Charles, as Charles meant a great deal to Roger. And this gathering is a dazzling thing to be a part of. So truly, thank you very much. I want to talk about Charles. And I hope I don't get out of phase, but if I do, that might be a virtuous thing these days. And I want to just run through a few of my photos as part of how one can see and glimpse and parts of how I got to know Charles. I do not mean to overstate our friendship, but I got to spend time with him in various special places and contexts a bit. Like Michael Barrett's terrace overlooking Central Park in Manhattan one time. So this is Charles on the rim of the world and saying profound things as the sun sets over the west side. Like Long Lake, this is Charles on the road leading to their home, which was an incredibly special location for all of his life. That's the view at the end, and Charles made sure that I learned that the name of the little peak peeking up in the distance was the owl, or the small owl. Lee, you have to help me a little bit, but owl's head. And what Charles said, not the main peak, but off on the left side, there's a little bit of a rising nub. It's not a great photograph. But Charles said, it's interesting not to see the whole thing. You glimpse the top of the owl's head. And that always stuck with me. This is Charles, and Charles at work with one of his white foolscap pads and his blue pen on his knees on the steps at that house, scribbling ideas, sometimes more suggestive than developed, which he did for his whole life. And some of them eventually became published, and some of them continue to percolate. I have a whole bunch of book proposals and concepts and drafts and things that we ping pong back and forth. I'm sure Roger does too. I'm sure Judith does too. I'm sure that in time the manuscripts and archives at Sterling Library should too, because that is intellectual grist for the ages, even if Charles didn't finish it all. And this is Charles reading. Same house, inside, crackling fire on a summer night, but in the Adirondacks, with a notepad near him for a doodle or two as a great thought occurred to him. Just to be in the presence and kind of glimpse this was not watching a performance, it was seeing the authentic thing. And this is Charles in his apartment in San Francisco. Roger has put these prints out on the table too. I got to visit him there, I think this is 2008. And Charles in his lair, which by the way had that view from his table that's a lookout toward the Mark Hopkins and Russian Hill. That's a good place to be and think and sit and write. Charles found a way to sort of get to the special. And we exchanged a lot of correspondence. This nicely, and let's keep this private, sort of echoes on something you discussed on the first panel. It's a little note that Charles sent to me during September of 2005 as Judge John Roberts of the DC Circuit was testifying because he'd been nominated to be Chief Justice of the United States. And Charles said, Judith, you used the word creep. Charles's word here is creeps. But Charles wrote, for some reason I can't fathom him, he gives me the creeps. He seems alien and unreal. Let's stay in touch. Now, you know, it's flippant. Charles would also say to me regularly, I don't want this to show up on your blog. But the ideas and the engagement was something that, you know, didn't stop when Charles retired and didn't stop when Charles published his last article. It was Charles at his core. I also want to show you, actually before, how do I move to the film? I want to show you one film clip. Minimize. Escape. Got it, okay. This goes to the date. I want to show you a little film clip.
Crowds at Ebbets Baseball Field, Brooklyn, greet President Roosevelt starting his tour of New York City. Here on behalf of his friend Senator Bob Wagner, Mr. Roosevelt has a special word for Brooklyn Dodger fans.
You know, I come from the state of New York, and I've got to make a terrible confession to you. I come from the state of New York, and I practice law in New York City, but I have never been in Ebbets Field before. I rooted for the Dodgers. And I hope to come back here someday and see them play.
Now the procession through the metropolis in a downpour of rain which Mr. Roosevelt braves in an open car.
This is the part where I want you to look closely. We are in the first days of November 1944. By the way, for those who say Roosevelt was walking dead and dysfunctional in 1944, you just saw a film clip of how he was speaking at that time period. But look at these crowds and imagine two teenage boys who are standing in the rain and watching the President of the United States go by.
FDR's first outdoor appearance as a campaigning candidate. He doesn't seem to mind the weather one bit. New York certainly knows there's a political campaign on. At the Waldorf Astoria.
Those boys were Charles and Peter Reich. They lived on East 68th Street. Charles, born in 1928, thus was 16 years old, and I think Peter was 3 years younger. And this was a memory that Charles shared with me over and over again. Here's one time in print. And watching him drive past in an open car in the rain on Broadway in 1944. So here's the topic I want to comment on for the remainder of my short time. Charles is a son of the New Deal. He's born in 1928. He lives a 1930s boyhood. He's a Democrat. He's Jewish. He's growing up in New York City. He grows up to be a close colleague of New Dealers, Hugo Black, William Douglas, Abe Fortas, Thurman Arnold, Paul Porter, Thomas Emerson. Charles Reich is a liberal. He's a man of the left. And as Jillian mentioned, among others, when you read The Greening of America, etc., you find lots of anti-New Deal commentary and rhetoric, or at least language that can be grabbed and purposed in that way. I want to comment on that and what's going on and how we should think about locating Charles in this kind of left-right, New Deal, anti-New Deal, modern state, administrative state, roll back the bureaucracy that verges on tyranny moment that we live in, including judicially. Charles's New Deal, as I see it, is really a longing for the old deal, perhaps an overly romantic ideal of individual flourishing. If you travel his schematic of Consciousness 1, the American pioneer, and Consciousness 2, the bureaucratized victim, and then Consciousness 3, the breakout, I think there's a kind of circle from high to low and then rise that one can graph. At least that's a way that I think about it. And part of the high and part of the recovery and the rise, located chronologically in the 1930s, the boyhood of Charles and Peter, yes, a couple of years later, applause on Broadway in 1944 when the candidate is seeking his last reelection, is an embrace of a necessary philosophy of care, of a kind of, obviously, Great Depression, rescue, public assistance, enhanced decency that was part of public life. And that is, as I see it, Charles's New Deal. It let the individual get away from the bad, and Charles, in many ways across his own biography, found ways to navigate away from the complex or the bad to things that he found more congenial in his family, in his very close relationship with his wonderful brother, in his time at Yale, and then in his westward departure from Yale, and then in his wonderful return to Yale, in private practice, and then getting out of private practice. You sort of see this upward trajectory. The New Deal, rescue, decency, time of care is that pattern. Dehumanization, industrial mechanization, the machine grinding too much on the people is, of course, the bottom side of that circular cycle process that I'm drawing in the air. And I think that might well be something that is mislabeled if we think of that as New Deal. And perhaps Charles is guilty of mislabeling a little bit of it in The Greening of America, et cetera, because I think he's not really attacking the 30s and the 40s. I think he's attacking the 50s. I think he's attacking the time period of his adulthood, the period of McCarthyism, the period of more bureaucratic, less sympathetic, less Social Security seeking government. And then, of course, the ramifications of that continued into the 1960s. Now, that may not add up. And a big question that I always had for Charles was, and who pays? Because the questions of material sufficiency are, of course, underneath social welfare and Social Security, an ethic of care, a land of greater decency. But having been with Charles in Long Lake, I think I got a sense that it might not be, or at least as he saw it, it might not need to be so expensive. He hung out with the locals, people whose lives weren't full and satisfactory, but found connections and moments of happiness with them and understood them. He told me about this guy, Hoss, who ran the big store. He introduced me to Jim and Donna at the Stewart's gas station. People get by, and that can be much better than being desperate. And a government that helps people get by, and with decency and process and fairness, the new property arguments, et cetera, is doing a whole lot to get us out of the depths of something like the Great Depression to something like the happiness spots and moments and places that were parts of Charles's life. It was, of course, a very special, dazzling, unique life. Were he still living, Jerry Garcia could be here because he was a friend of Charles Reich. It's as close as I've ever gotten to Jerry Garcia. Charles was a fan of Fountains of Wayne music. Charles had high and low, left and right, east and west, law and very far from law, interests and friends and connections that were part of his consciousness, the destination that he had reached, and I think is the example. So I think for myself, what I carry forward, without him as a living friend, but with him as a very powerful memory, is an inspiration to sort of find your meaning, your consciousness, your security, even if you are out of phase, to find the spots and moments of happiness of two brothers in their togetherness, in their security with each other, in their fair amount of prosperity, but in their inclinations, each of them and together, to sort of hike out away from that, to rough it, to seek beauty, to have wilderness, to paddle an authentic birch bark canoe, to be believers in excitement, including if it is personified in somebody who seems like one who should be followed. And that's the date part of this great serendipity, because we're not only here remembering Charles. This is a wonderful thing. We're here on January 30th. And one nice little piece of serendipity that I don't think Roger knew, I think this is just Turo scheduling the event, is you picked Franklin Roosevelt's birthday. Thank you all.